World Health Organization plans to classify gaming disorder as a mental health condition in the newest edition of its disease classification manual.
Isn't it? The American Academy of Pediatrics says 92% of school-age kids play video games. Nearly 10% of those kids are addicts.
And video games are a real problem. They're a real problem. You do them and they're real exciting, but you don't get any.
Or gaming addiction in general can lead to depression, childhood obesity, and get this, you guys, it can lead to dementia.
McDonald is seeking counseling. He wants his son to join him.
I think he thinks I'm addicted. I think I'm just having fun with friends.
There's a 9-year-old girl, her parents sent her to therapy saying that she was addicted to playing Fortnite.
And I think the World Health Organization calling this out will allow insurance to start to cover this. Therapy for this.
What? But therapy for gaming addiction?
Because
we got to pay for that now?
Well, because
there's a story in the Mirror, right? 9-year-old girl is in intensive therapy after becoming so hooked on Fortnite, she wet herself to keep playing.
Carry on playing.
Games are designed to be fun,
But that's not fun. That's an addiction.
In 2018, the World Health Organization officially declared gaming disorder as a real mental health disease.
The organization is now designating gaming disorder as a mental health condition.
An inevitable outcome due to the growing stigma surrounding video game culture.
The American Psychological Association made a definitive statement. There is a clear, unequivocal link between violent video games, violent behavior.
The diagnosis of this disease isn't as simple as playing for several hours each day. It's more severe. For someone to be diagnosed, a distinctive symptom they would have to show is where the act of playing games eclipses other desires and responsibilities. Skipping school, calling off work, and losing vital sleep, all to sink in more hours of gameplay. These symptoms would need to occur for at least 12 months before one can be diagnosed with this disorder. According to the World Health Organization, of the 2 billion people that play video games worldwide, about 3 to 4% of players have the disorder. That's roughly 80 million people. Many news outlets around the globe have attempted to expose video games for their supposed addictive tactics, in hopes to get their governments to regulate the entertainment medium. But most countries have failed to put effort in treating the disorder, except for one, a country that contains the largest population in the world, China. In China, gaming has been a threat to the country's well-being for decades. Back in 2000, the State Administration of Radio, Film, and Television imposed a near-complete ban on game consoles. For 15 years, consoles like the Xbox and PlayStation were prohibited from being sold and manufactured within the country due to concerns about their potential negative impact. This impact being a rise in video game addiction amongst their youth. Nintendo was the exception, though in order for them to release a console within the country, they had to exclusively produce one that fit the country's guidelines. That console was the iQ Player, a console that played N64 titles. While these bans were set in place, the citizens followed the laws like US drivers following the speed limit. They were often ignored. Private sellers existed aplenty. Regardless of how effective the bans were, this was just a start at tackling gaming within the country. The Chinese government also feared that these games would take away their youth's focus from their academics, but these regulations didn't keep kids from finding other ways to play. Internet cafes. As common in China as your typical convenience store, these cafes are designed to provide internet access to nearby citizens. Whether it's to game, to surf the web, or print important documents, these multi-purpose cafes are easily accessible for all. Typically though, most people that use these cafes are young children and adults for gaming. In the 2000s and 2010s, the amount of cafes within the country were in the 100,000s. Prices to rent a computer for use varies, but there are some that are as low as 80 cents an hour. The reason why so many young people use them is due to practicality. It's a cheap way to play games. Building a PC or purchasing a console is expensive. Being able to spend $5 to $10 every week to game fits more within the average person's budget. It's out of sight from parents. Gaming for long hours is almost never the best idea when living with parents that expect complete focus on academics. At internet cafes, You're able to game for as long as you want without worrying about what your parents think. These cafes also incentivize you to stay longer, providing deals where if you stay longer, you pay less. While it is cheaper, it's this kind of incentive that draws in a troubled crowd of gamers. While percentage rates of gamers addicted to video games remains to be determined, what's clear for the Chinese government is that it's a significant problem. The majority of those that go to these cafes to game are able to moderate themselves quite well, leaving the cafe after an hour or two of playing. But there's a concerning minority that finds themselves staying for longer. Not 3 to 4 hours, not 8. We're talking for over 12 hours straight, with uncommon cases of gamers playing at these cafes for more than 24 hours. And no, I am not exaggerating that number. Many of these players spend more than just the amount needed to use a computer. A lot of the games played at these cafes and throughout the country in general are gacha games. For those that don't know what these are, essentially they're games that rely on spending real currency for randomized in-game transactions. A video went viral all over social media, where a mother and father publicly beat their son in an internet cafe for spending their life savings all on a single game. A whopping $41,000 US. Now there are stories like this all over the world. It isn't exclusive to China. But notice how everyone around the kid that's getting beaten doesn't seem to bat an eye. This kind of disregard only gets worse from here. In rare cases, some of these gamers won't even get out of their chairs for a break. They'll go days without food or water or even sunlight. It's this level of gaming that has led to the deaths of many at these cafes. There's something horrifically sad here. What goes through someone's mind to not get up once in 40 hours of playing? How does one get so invested where the virtual world becomes their reality? How does the sight of a dying man's body not make others stop what they're doing? How does a death like this even happen? Pulmonary embolism. In these cases, it occurs when a blood clot forms in the legs from prolonged sitting and travels its way up to the lungs. If it were to get stuck up there, the person would experience chest pain, violent coughing, and shortage of breath. Understand that these deaths are extremely rare though. The likelihood of this happening is in the decimals. It only happens to those that sit for long periods of time without standing up. Regardless, it has happened enough times for governments to use these cases as prime examples for their arguments. With how gaming has affected the many lives in China, the Chinese Communist Party looked for new ways to regulate gaming. After lifting the ban on consoles and focusing on companies to follow their guidelines, they took it a step further and began to limit playtime for players under the age of 18. In the year 2019, China imposed restrictions on the durations minors are able to spend playing online games. To enforce these regulations, game developers had to include real name registration systems. The systems would require your passport information, like your passport number and photo, in order to play. To keep minors from going over the time limits, game developers for online games are required to add forced time limits. If any minor were to violate these regulations, They would be fined or in some cases have their license to play revoked. But gaming disorder had only grown worse after this, the reason being a pandemic that took the world by storm, COVID-19. When COVID-19 hit, many cafes were forced to close. Many areas within the country were under strict lockdown. If one person was infected in a building, the whole building would be considered a high-risk area, requiring every resident to go into quarantine, regardless if they tested negative.
这个是这个人在叫，完了终于200人，所有人都在叫，就刚刚5分钟前头，叫没几个人，现在突然之间，所有人都叫了。
So those who would leave their homes to play at these cafes had to find other ways to play. They purchased gaming PCs and consoles to play at home. Many continued to follow the regulations set by the government, but there were a noticeable number of players that seemed to find loopholes around the system. As the country faced one of its darkest years in recent times, an escape was much needed. With the inability to leave their homes and their education being switched to online only, gaming became their only source of socialization. But in these chaotic times, video game addiction grew to greater heights. At this point, it was up to parents to find a way to deal with this. If the pleading or disciplining failed, there was only one option left: detox centers for gaming. Intense rehab centers targeted at minors, many of which use military forms of discipline.
我们过去在家坐到那个电脑旁坐的太多了，叫你们搞好身心一体化，实际上就是提高你的这个身体素质啊。
Physical activities are demanding. Schedules are strict. Use of technology is near non-existent. The purpose of these centers are to break the cycle of gaming addiction, or internet addiction as they call it, to those that have it the worst.
昨天早上回来，妈开始说，然后我就蒙着被子开始坐起来听。今天住了3天，然后感觉还是蛮不错。
Many of these children are brought here by their parents unwillingly.
你干什么事儿了？
我在家上网。不是我妈妈说带我到北京来看病的，他就把我关在这里，他们就是把我的手捆住。
一是被骗，还有一个是被打了麻药或者打了什么镇定剂之类抓过来。
是谁给打完？家长？
家长，然后一般都是家长，有的时候也是基地派过去人。据说还有一个孩子是被7、8个教官追踪睡觉的嘛，然后家长签协议，7、8个教官给他扛过来的，然后一觉醒来就到基地来了，好多都是。
For the first few days, their worlds are flipped upside down. Occasionally, some of these children are visited by parents, though the interactions are rarely heartwarming.
当你上网的那几个月，你从来不知道父母的日子是怎么过的。当你的键盘声一声声传入妈妈的耳朵的时候，妈妈的心里是怎么样的？就看着我的儿子就这样荒废了学业，就这样沉迷于网络。
懒得理他们。
There are other cases, though, where the parents don't visit them at all and refuse to take part in their child's treatment.
对呀，你这才作为一个父亲，做了父亲应该做的事情，你不能把他放在这儿，然后你走了。
The ones that do take part are shocked when they realize they're partly to blame for their child's addiction.
就是觉得这些话最能刺激你，最能让你改变，最能让你反省，最能让你进步。 哦，那么他们病态的心理实践，就是说这些孩子来打心理，他 孩子一辈子的内心世界就是孤独，孤独。你了解他吗？他孤独。
This is where we start to see cracks in this disorder, and it makes many wonder, are games really the problem here? There's a bigger picture here that is often disregarded, and that's the quality of life within the country. As I've stated before, parents have extremely high expectations for their children. Getting into a respected university in China is a very competitive challenge. Each student will attend class from 7:30 a.m. to 6 p.m. After 6 p.m., most students will continue to study till midnight for 6 days a week. Students will study 10 to 12 hours on average. The families that are wealthy pay tutors to help their children for rates that range anywhere from $120 to $400 an hour. There are countless stories online of teachers mistreating their students, comparing their scores to previous years, calling them useless and disappointments. The teachers see it as motivation. The students, though, see it as shaming. The stress, pressure, and anxiety that stems from the education system all builds up to one important event for every high schooler: the Gaikao. The Gaikao is a national college entrance exam that every student must take if they wish to get into a notable university. It is known to be one of the most difficult exams in the world. In the US, hundreds and hundreds of students have gotten a perfect SAT score. With the Gaikao, no student has ever achieved a perfect score. In 2023, almost 13 million students took the exam. In order to reach a top university, a student must score a 600 or above out of 750. Only 3% score above that. The exam lasts for 10 hours over the span of 2 days. 2 days where parents crowd outside the testing centers in nervousness. The parents need their children to succeed, especially those that come from low-income areas. The Chinese Communist Party needs them to as well. The reason parents push their children so much is because they know the country is highly competitive. They want what they think is best for them, a great education so they don't have to live a stress-filled life. To low-income areas, the Gaikao is viewed as a way out. It's an overwhelming desire that's globally understandable.
你将来到社会上面，谁能把你当公主？谁能把你当王子？啊，你在家是公主，社会上社会和参主啊，不是人，明天人上人。我就觉得人生必须要经历一些苦难，沉重了，家长乐意了，孩子找上好工作了，成立了个好家庭了，有什么不好呢？啊，有什么不好？张顺在哪里啊？张顺在哪里啊？啊，老弟，我在班上上课。
我自己为了孩子付出了很多，真的很多。我把厂体谅，为了孩子，我尽孝，我的努力没有白费，努力没有白费，有回报。就为了一个梦想，就为了一个梦想，圆了一个梦，这是真感动。
So when a school-focused child gets their hands on a game, the potential of that game throwing them off course is worrisome.
说的话，那我一个暑假2个月，我基本上就没有下过电了。差不多，我也是。
上瘾了以后，像海洛因一样，自己都不能自拔。
This is not just seen as a threat by parents, it's a threat to the entire nation. And that is why gaming is so heavily regulated. But what does the schooling system have to do with gaming disorder? When school begins to become overwhelming, grades tend to suffer. When grades take a dive, parents will notice this. Schools notice this. Negative feelings about the future begin to develop. Perceptions of us will sour. Suddenly, motivation goes out the window. Our brains will desperately search for protection from these thoughts and feelings. Many of the games these addicts play contain rank systems, or feature a heavy amount of valuable skins that are locked behind progression levels. When a high rank is finally reached, or a skin is attained and visible to other players, it gives the player a high sense of accomplishment.
本来学习上超不过人家，然后在游戏上别人都不行。就是有没有感觉自己很牛逼嘛？至少在一方面比别人强嘛。
虚拟社会中可以感觉到很快乐。
In our brains, that feeling of accomplishment is a release of dopamine, a neurotransmitter that gives people pleasure, satisfaction, and motivation. For these people, games aren't necessarily an escape. They're a form of shelter that our brains will latch onto in times of need. And in recent years, the regulations have been statistically proven to lower addiction rates. About 75% of the youth population have shown to play less than 3 hours a week, which according to the China Game Industry Group Committee is a major success. Many news outlets from around the world have noticed these results and have begun to advocate similar regulations for their own countries.
They're also, by the way, worried about video games in China. Online gaming for children in China will now be limited to 3 hours a week on the weekends. What's interesting is, when was the last time you heard one of our political leaders even mention video games as a problem? Now, before you respond by saying that politicians shouldn't be involved in our personal lives, remember that the CDC already very much is involved in our personal lives.
According to China, gaming addiction has been resolved thanks to regulations and no longer seems to be a threat. With this in mind, at what point do other countries start taking inspiration? What will it take for a country to regulate gaming? Maybe we're already beginning to see it. Maybe the regulations will come sooner than we think.